February 2, 1943, Stalingrad, Soviet Union. In the bitter cold of the Russian winter, Adelbert, a German soldier trapped in the Stalingrad encirclement, struggled to hold a pencil in his frost-numbed fingers. In a hidden journal, he chronicled the collapse of his unit, foreshadowing one of the deadliest prisoner crises in military history. "Our bodies are nothing but walking bones," Hull noted. "Most of our comrades have perished from starvation or the relentless cold, and now we are to surrender to an enemy who bears no mercy for us." Through the shattered remains of residential blocks, he could watch German soldiers moving in ragged columns towards Soviet collection points. These men, hardened by months of some of the fiercest urban combat the world had ever witnessed, were stepping into a captivity that would decimate their ranks. Of the 91,000 who surrendered that day, an estimated 85,000 would die within captivity. Within half a year, only about 6,000 would remain alive. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away in North Africa, German troops experienced an entirely different fate. 3 months later, Gerright Hino Ericson of the Africa Corps was captured in Tunisia. In his memoir, The Reluctant Warrior, he recounted, "The Americans provided us with water, chocolate, and cigarettes. Though they lacked sufficient rations at first, they promised that warm meals would follow soon. We were stunned by how humane they treated prisoners." These contrasting experiences, occurring within months of each other in 1943, highlight one of the most striking disparities in World War II. The survival of a German soldier often depended entirely on the location of his surrender. Geography became a cruel determinant of life or death. Statistical evidence underscores this stark difference. Of roughly 3 million German troops captured by the Soviets, between 1 and 1.1 million perished while in captivity. The Moshka Commission's research recorded a mortality rate of 35.8%. By contrast, of 425,000 Germans held by American forces, fewer than 1,000 died, representing a mortality rate below 1%. Beneath these numbers lay two profoundly different approaches to the value of human life, the purpose of victory, and the treatment of defeated opponents. The fall of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked the start of the largest prisoner catastrophe in the nation's military history. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, recently promoted by Hitler in an effort to encourage suicide over surrender, capitulated to the Soviets on January 31, 1943. 2 days later, the remaining forces formally gave up. Among the survivors, 91,000 men out of an original 330,000 was Adelbert, whose later memoir would provide historians with one of the most detailed insights into Soviet imprisonment practices. As Hull and his fellow soldiers left their defensive positions, Soviet troops immediately confiscated any valuable possessions, including warm clothing, boots, and watches. Those who resisted were executed on the spot. The march from Stalingrad to transit camps began immediately. Exhausted men, already weakened by starvation, were forced to traverse dozens of kilometers in temperatures plummeting to -30 degrees Celsius. Hull later recalled, "Many simply fell and did not rise again. The guards did not need to fire a shot. The cold itself did the work within minutes." The surrender at Stalingrad and the ensuing march stand as a grim testament to the devastating consequences of war and the extreme disparity in the treatment of prisoners between different Allied powers. Across the Mediterranean, a sharply contrasting situation was taking shape. In May 1943, the German Africa Corps, renowned for its desert warfare expertise, officially capitulated to Allied forces in Tunisia. Among the 275,000 Axis soldiers who became prisoners were many of Germany's most battle-hardened troops, veterans who had previously forced British forces to retreat to Egypt and earned the grudging respect of their opponents. The disparity in how these soldiers were treated became evident almost immediately. American personnel tasked with processing the German captives adhered strictly to the Geneva Conventions. Prisoners were provided with medical evaluations, sufficient food and water, and proper shelter. The International Red Cross was informed of their capture, guaranteeing that family members would be kept informed. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, writing from American detention, described the unexpected quality of care. "We were given fresh bread, genuine coffee, and real meat, things we had not seen for months. At first, we assumed it was propaganda, a deliberate display. It was hard to believe that this was simply the standard military provision." While German soldiers captured by the Soviets were perishing by the thousands in transit camps, those under American control were systematically moved to permanent facilities, equipped with medical support, regular meals, and oversight by the Red Cross. The process of transportation itself reflected the priorities and capacities of the captors. For Germans in Soviet hands, travel became a lethal ordeal. The Soviet railway system, strained from war damage and overextension, was focused primarily on supplying frontline troops rather than on prisoner welfare. When trains were available, captives were crammed into unheated freight cars intended for goods rather than human beings. Survivor accounts collected by the Machte Commission reveal the dire conditions. Prisoners were so tightly packed that they had to take turns sitting, with no toilet facilities available. Water was infrequently supplied, sometimes hurled through car doors, and food was little more than occasional scraps of bread. Walter Ward, who was captured in 1944, recounted, "We began the march with about 5,000 men, but by the time we reached the rail station, only 3,500 remained. During the journey by train, hundreds more perished. Death became an unrelenting presence." The Bekovka transit camp near Stalingrad provides a stark example of Soviet practices. Initially little more than dugouts and ruined structures, it was inundated with tens of thousands of prisoners without any provisions for survival. Latrines were nothing more than open pits that soon overflowed, and drinking water came from a river contaminated with corpses from the battlefield. In sharp contrast, German soldiers sent to the United States traveled under far less harrowing conditions. They were transported aboard Liberty ships, vessels also used to ferry American troops to Europe. These ships were not luxurious, but they offered proper sleeping quarters, 3 meals per day, and basic sanitation, conditions that, for enemy soldiers, were strikingly humane. The divergence in treatment between the American and Soviet handling of prisoners not only highlighted differences in resources and infrastructure, but also reflected the underlying intentions of each power, one emphasizing order, care, and compliance with international norms, the other shaped by revenge, chaos, and logistical strain. The journey across the Atlantic generally lasted around 2 weeks. During the voyage, prisoners were provided with routine meals, opportunities to spend time on deck for physical activity, and medical care for injuries or illnesses. While the ship crews maintained strict security, they occasionally engaged in limited conversation with prisoners who spoke English. Upon arriving at American ports, mainly Norfolk, Boston, and New York, the captives were struck by their first exposure to the industrial and urban landscape of the United States. The thriving cities, filled with constant activity and illuminated by electric lights at night, sharply contradicted the image of American weakness propagated by Nazi messaging. Once transferred to permanent internment camps, the contrast between American and Soviet systems for handling prisoners became starkly apparent. German soldiers entering Soviet detention facilities were met with infrastructure primarily designed to extract labor for economic purposes at minimal expense. In contrast, those sent to American camps often found accommodations that surpassed even standard military barracks in Germany. Soviet camps, administered under GUPW, the central authority managing prisoners of war and internees, functioned as part of the broader Gulag system. These camps were effectively labor units contributing to the reconstruction of the Soviet state. Prisoners' worth was measured almost entirely by their productivity, and those deemed unfit to work were provided with meager rations that often led to death within weeks. The Soviet camp network was dispersed across the country's vast territories. Collection points like Bekavonica, near Stalingrad, received prisoners first, while specialized camps in Siberia, such as Cherny NKVD Camp No. 48, accommodated higher-ranking officers. The Karaganda complex in Kazakhstan, one of the largest, extended over nearly 1.8 million hectares and could hold as many as 65,000 captives. The memoirs of Adelbert vividly depict the brutal reality. Prisoners lived in primitive holes, fought for scraps, and witnessed the dead being stripped of their clothing, with all traces of dignity erased by the constant struggle to survive. By contrast, German prisoners in the United States encountered facilities deliberately constructed to comply with Geneva Convention standards. Camp Hearn in Texas, at its maximum capacity, could house 4,800 prisoners across 680 acres, divided into 3 separate compounds, each featuring wooden barracks with electricity, running water, and heating systems. In Kansas, Camp Concordia contained 304 buildings, including a hospital with 177 beds, recreation halls, and classrooms. The largest facility in the southeastern United States, Camp Aliceville in Alabama, accommodated 6,000 inmates and offered advanced infrastructure, including a complete sewage system and electrical network. Hans Veer, who would later pursue a medical career in Maine, recalled his first impression with astonishment. The living conditions in the barracks exceeded those of German military installations. Each prisoner had a personal bunk with a mattress and blankets, flush toilets, hot showers, and electric lighting. The experiences of German prisoners thus highlighted a fundamental divergence in approaches to wartime captivity. While the Soviet system prioritized exploitation and survival at minimal cost, the American model emphasized humane treatment, standards of comfort, and compliance with international norms. Daily life in American and Soviet prisoner of war camps reflected fundamentally contrasting beliefs about human dignity and the objectives of confinement. These philosophical differences shaped every element of the prisoners' routines, from meals to labor, rest, and medical care. In American camps, the schedule was highly structured and predictable, designed both to ensure security and to respect prisoners' personal dignity. At Camp Concordia, mornings began promptly at 6 a.m. with roll call. Breakfast followed at 6:30 a.m., featuring hot cereal, bread with butter and jam, and coffee. By 8 a.m., prisoners assigned to work details departed for agricultural fields or maintenance tasks around the camp. Lunch, served at noon, usually included a balanced portion of meat, potatoes, and vegetables. Work continued until 5 p.m., after which dinner was provided, and prisoners had leisure time until lights out at 10 p.m. Food allotments were comparable to those given to American soldiers, providing roughly 3,300 calories per day. This included a daily pound of meat, unlimited bread, seasonal fresh vegetables, dairy products, coffee with sugar, and occasional treats such as ice cream on special days. Medical and mental health care in American camps was comprehensive. German doctors had the opportunity to collaborate with American medical staff, gaining experience with treatments like penicillin, which was not yet widely available in Germany. Programs for mental health support, rare in the prisoner's home country, helped them manage the psychological stresses of confinement. Franz Müller, an inmate at Camp Concordia, recalled the initial weeks with amazement. "We were almost overwhelmed by the abundance of food after years of shortages and strict military rations." By contrast, life in Soviet camps centered almost entirely on labor, with survival contingent upon meeting daily work quotas. Testimonies collected by the Mashka Commission indicate that the day began at 4 a.m. during summer and 5 a.m. in winter. Breakfast was minimal, often consisting only of hot water with a few grains of cereal and roughly 200 grams of dark bread. Prisoners labored for 10 to 16 hours, depending on the type of camp and seasonal demands. In lumber camps, prisoners were expected to cut and process fixed amounts of timber. Miners had quotas for ore extraction. Construction brigades faced daily targets. Falling short of these requirements resulted in reduced rations. Those who met their quotas received basic sustenance, 300 to 400 grams of bread, sometimes adulterated with sawdust, thin soup, occasionally supplemented with vegetables, and a minimal amount of sugar or salt, amounting to roughly 1,200 to 1,500 calories, barely half of what was needed for survival alongside strenuous labor. Hinrich Brandt, a survivor of 5 years in multiple camps, described the devastating effects. Our bodies gradually consumed themselves, first fat, then muscle, and ultimately vital organs began to fail. Although both the American and Soviet systems employed prisoner labor, the ways in which it was organized reflected sharply divergent underlying philosophies regarding human value and economic utility. In the United States, labor programs adhered closely to Geneva Convention standards. Prisoners could not be compelled to undertake dangerous tasks or work on military projects. Officers were completely exempt from labor duties, while enlisted men performed standard 8-hour workdays with Sundays off. Safety regulations mirrored those imposed on American civilian workers. By 1944, over 300,000 German prisoners were engaged in U.S. farms, forests, and construction projects. They harvested crops like sugar beets in Colorado, picked cotton in Texas, maintained forest lands in Oregon, and contributed to various projects across the nation. The labor program not only addressed critical wartime shortages, but also provided prisoners with purposeful activity and modest compensation. Prisoners earned the equivalent of 80 cents per day, roughly the wage of an American private, paid in camp script redeemable for goods in camp stores, or saved for use after repatriation. The stark contrasts between American and Soviet camps underscore how deeply political ideology and cultural values shaped the treatment of captives. While American policies emphasized humane treatment, structured routines, and opportunities for skill development, Soviet camps prioritized labor output at the expense of health and survival, highlighting a fundamentally utilitarian view of human life. In 1944, the United States government generated approximately $22 million through labor agreements involving prisoners of war. German detainees like Otto Kraus, who spent time on a Nebraska farm, noted a surprisingly humane environment. Farmers treated POWs more like temporary employees than captives. They shared meals with the family, acquired practical knowledge of American agricultural techniques, and were trusted with valuable machinery, reflecting an approach where work was framed as both instruction and contribution, rather than punishment. By contrast, the Soviet labor system functioned on fundamentally different assumptions. Labor was primarily a tool for punishment and resource extraction, with little concern for the well-being of those performing it. Prisoners were assigned tasks according to Reconstruction priorities, with expendability often factored into planning. The conditions were frequently lethal. Siberian logging crews endured deadly exposure and extreme fatigue, laboring in temperatures that could reach -40 degrees Celsius with minimal clothing. Mining operations, particularly in coal and uranium extraction, proved exceptionally dangerous, with frequent collapses and toxic exposure. Urban reconstruction brigades worked tirelessly through harsh weather to rebuild cities devastated by war. Reinhold Braun recalled the unrelenting demands. Initially required to fill 2 train cars with timber per shift, the quota soon increased to 3. Workdays stretched to 16 hours, including Sundays and holidays. Soviet planners were fully aware that this combination of extreme labor and poor nutrition would cause death, but calculated that maximum output before mortality was more efficient than maintaining prisoner health over time. treatment of officer prisoners revealed stark contrasts in adherence to international law and military tradition. The Geneva Convention exempted officers from labor and provided for improved living conditions. In the United States, these provisions were observed rigorously. German officers were housed in separate sections with superior amenities. For instance, Camp Trinidad in Colorado accommodated around 2,000 officers, including nobility, physicians, and academics, offering individual rooms, expanded library access, and extensive educational programming. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, 3 admirals and 40 generals lived in private bungalows with gardens, maintained correspondence via the Red Cross, and produced memoirs that would later serve as valuable historical sources. Soviet treatment of captured officers was inconsistent and often driven by propaganda needs. Many officers, particularly from the SS, were executed immediately upon capture. Survivors faced a hierarchy of conditions determined largely by their potential utility for Soviet messaging. High-ranking figures like Field Marshal Paulus received comparatively comfortable arrangements at specialized facilities such as NKVD Camp 48, with adequate nutrition and access to media, under the expectation they would support Soviet initiatives like the National Committee for a Free Germany. Lower-ranking officers without propaganda value were given minimal rations, technically exempt from labor, yet often compelled to work voluntarily to supplement food, effectively sacrificing Geneva Convention protections to survive. Communication with family had a profound impact on prisoner morale. In American camps, a reliable system allowed 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, carefully censored for security, but generally permitting personal content. Mail passed through Red Cross channels via Switzerland, taking 2 to 3 months in transit, but reached recipients consistently. Families could send packages containing food, clothing, reading material, and photographs. Wilhelm Hartmann, detained at Camp Herne, emphasized the psychological significance. Knowing that his letters were received reassured him that he was alive and strengthened his resolve to endure captivity. In contrast, Soviet camps imposed near-total communication blackouts, intensifying isolation and psychological strain. In sum, the contrast between American and Soviet prisoner labor systems was profound. The United States emphasized structured opportunity, legal compliance, and humane treatment, while the Soviet Union prioritized maximum extraction and political objectives, often at the cost of human life. These differences shaped the daily experiences, survival rates, and long-term physical and psychological effects for prisoners under each regime. During the early years of Soviet imprisonment, communication with the outside world was almost entirely impossible. Captured individuals were effectively cut off from their families, often for extended periods of several years. When correspondence eventually became feasible, usually after 1947, it was strictly limited to brief messages, typically 25 words per month on standardized postcards. Prior to this partial reopening, relatives had no formal acknowledgement of their loved ones' fates. As a result, millions of German households lived for years in profound uncertainty, unsure whether family members were deceased or held in captivity. Medical treatment further underscored the stark contrast between the approaches of the 2 powers. American prisoner of war facilities prioritized health care, often providing levels of medical attention that exceeded what prisoners had experienced as civilians. In stark contrast, Soviet camps focused on labor utility, offering only rudimentary care for those deemed capable of work. Each U.S. military camp maintained hospital units that met professional military standards, conducting regular inspections to detect emerging health issues. Prisoners could receive surgeries, dental treatment, and ongoing care for chronic ailments. Vaccination campaigns were implemented to prevent outbreaks of communicable diseases. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a German surgeon interned at Camp Herne, later noted that his surgical experience as a prisoner allowed him to perform more successful operations than he had achieved in German field hospitals, thanks to the availability of penicillin, sulfa drugs, anesthetics, and other medicines that were scarce in wartime Germany. By contrast, the Soviet approach to medical care ranged from minimal attention to complete neglect. Most camps lacked even basic facilities, and diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread unchecked among already weakened prisoners. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, served as the main external humanitarian observer, but its effectiveness depended entirely on the cooperation of the captor nation. In American camps, ICRC representatives were allowed frequent and thorough inspections, visiting each major facility multiple times per year. They conducted private interviews with prisoners, evaluated camp conditions, and investigated grievances, producing reports that could shape policy and ensure compliance with the Geneva Conventions. The Soviet Union, however, denied all Red Cross access. When Germany requested in 1941 that prisoner lists be exchanged via the ICRC, Foreign Minister Molotov explicitly instructed subordinates not to respond. This refusal left millions of families in prolonged uncertainty, and it effectively concealed conditions that would have sparked international criticism. Statistical records highlight the dramatic differences in prisoner treatment. Of roughly 425,000 German soldiers detained by the United States, only between 850 and 1,000 died, representing a mortality rate below 0.25%. Fatalities resulted from accidents during labor, disease, and prisoner-on-prisoner violence, including 135 confirmed killings carried out by die-hard Nazi sympathizers. The data illustrates a striking disparity in survival outcomes and overall living conditions between American and Soviet camps, reflecting the broader philosophies and priorities of the two captor nations. Soviet records on the fate of German prisoners of war present a strikingly different picture than Western sources. Official Soviet statistics report that 381,670 Germans died out of the 2,388,443 POWs in their custody. Yet research conducted by the Mashutka Commission documented deaths numbering 1,942,050 among a cohort of 360,000 prisoners. Modern historian Rüdiger Overmans has estimated that the overall German death toll in Soviet captivity likely fell between 1 and 1.1 million. Conditions were especially catastrophic for those captured at Stalingrad. Of the 91,000 soldiers taken prisoner in February 1943, roughly 85,000 perished within just a few months, leaving only 5,000 to 6,000 survivors who were eventually repatriated during the 1950s. The conclusion of the war in May 1945 marked immediate freedom for German POWs held by the Americans, in sharp contrast to those under Soviet control. Repatriation of American-held prisoners began within weeks after Germany's surrender. Prior to leaving the camps, prisoners were required to watch films depicting the liberation of Nazi concentration camps. At Camp Butner, for example, 1,000 men spontaneously burned their uniforms after seeing footage from Bergen-Belsen, a symbolic act of defiance and emotional release. By the end of 1946, nearly all German detainees had left American facilities. The process of returning prisoners from Soviet camps, however, followed a far more drawn-out and selective path. Initial releases in 1945 mostly involved severely injured or sick men whose labor potential could not justify their continued upkeep. Those who were fit for work were retained for post-war reconstruction projects. Major repatriation waves did not occur until 1947-1948, yet a significant number, approximately 85,000 men, remained classified as war criminals. Complete return of all remaining POWs required high-level diplomatic negotiations. From September 9 to 13, 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow to conduct direct talks with Soviet officials. The outcome was an agreement to release the final prisoners in exchange for establishing formal diplomatic relations between the two nations. The last German POWs did not return home until January 1956, more than a decade after the end of hostilities. The circumstances of returning prisoners varied greatly depending on where and when they had been held. Those who had been in American camps and returned between 1945 and 1946 arrived in a Germany beginning the arduous process of rebuilding. Many reintegrated relatively quickly, with the skills and experience gained in captivity sometimes proving advantageous. In contrast, veterans of Soviet imprisonment faced far harsher reintegration challenges. Those who returned in the late 1940s found families fractured by occupation, political division, or the absence of household members. Many discovered that wives had remarried, children scarcely recognized them, and aging parents had passed away during the long wait. The physical condition of returning men was often shocking. Skeletal frames, severely aged faces, and lingering signs of malnutrition testified to the extreme hardships endured. The final wave of repatriates in 1955-1956 confronted perhaps the most jarring adjustment. After a decade of absence, they returned to a West Germany experiencing rapid economic recovery. Their profound suffering and physical decline appeared almost out of place in a society focused on rebuilding and progress. The stark differences in POW experiences left enduring social, political, and legal legacies, shaping both Cold War dynamics and international norms for decades to come. The experiences of German prisoners of war varied significantly depending on whether they were held by American or Soviet forces. Those interned in American camps largely managed to reintegrate into civilian life after the war, with around 5,000 eventually choosing to emigrate to the United States. In contrast, survivors of Soviet captivity frequently carried long-lasting physical injuries and psychological trauma, which shaped not only their personal lives but also the broader political landscape of post-war Germany. Former prisoners from U.S. camps often emerged as proponents of closer ties with Western nations, while those who endured Soviet imprisonment frequently became outspoken critics of communism, their accounts contributing to a societal skepticism toward Soviet influence in West Germany. The lessons drawn from these divergent experiences directly informed revisions to international law. The 1949 Geneva Conventions introduced specific measures addressing abuses characteristic of Soviet detention practices, including guaranteed access for the International Committee of the Red Cross, limitations on forced labor outside essential camp maintenance, and requirements for the prompt repatriation of prisoners. The ways in which the experiences of prisoners have been commemorated reveal broader trends in how societies remember war. American camps left few enduring physical remnants, as most were dismantled shortly after liberation. Camp Hearn, however, now hosts a modest museum celebrating German-American cooperation, reflecting an effort by former internees to preserve the structures they had constructed as symbols of resilience and ingenuity under hardship. By contrast, former Soviet camps rarely resulted in any dedicated memorial infrastructure within the territories of the former USSR. The prevailing Soviet narrative framed the captivity of German soldiers as a justified response to wartime aggression. In Germany, organizations of former prisoners who had been held by the Soviets took the initiative to establish memorials, ensuring that their experiences were not forgotten. While contemporary historical research increasingly recognizes the specific crimes that provoked Soviet retaliation, the experiences of German POWs continue to provide valuable insights for modern conflict management. One enduring lesson is the connection between humane treatment and cooperative behavior, which informs present-day detention policies. The recognition that the treatment of prisoners can influence post-conflict reconciliation has become a critical factor in military and strategic planning. Modern doctrine acknowledges that operational decisions on the ground can have far-reaching strategic implications. The narrative of German POWs in American and Soviet custody raises essential questions about the moral dimensions of military victory, the preservation of human dignity in defeat, and the responsibilities inherent in wielding power over others. Statistical records reveal starkly contrasting outcomes for prisoners of war. American detention facilities managed to safeguard the lives of nearly all captives, with survival rates reaching 99%, allowing these individuals to later contribute to the post-war rebuilding of Europe. In contrast, Soviet camps claimed the lives of more than 1 million German soldiers, leaving a trail of enduring trauma. Yet beyond numerical comparisons, the lived experiences of these prisoners shed light on profound insights into political ideologies and ethical choices. The U.S. approach, grounded in democratic principles and respect for legal norms, demonstrated that a military force could exercise strength without sacrificing moral standards. The rules outlined in the Geneva Conventions were not treated as a mere formality, but were actively upheld, reflecting confidence that humane treatment would not weaken strategic security. This approach proved its effectiveness as many former American POWs became allies in the emerging Cold War. Conversely, the Soviet method, shaped by economic pragmatism and retribution, exposed the inherent flaws of totalitarian governance. Treating prisoners as disposable labor optimized immediate exploitation but resulted in long-term strategic setbacks, simultaneously sowing bitterness that would affect German-Soviet relations for decades. First-hand accounts provide vivid testimony to these contrasting approaches. Hans Vaplusker, who endured American captivity, ultimately chose to settle in the United States. Adelbert survived 7 years in Soviet detention, carrying lasting physical and psychological injuries. The divergent outcomes of these individuals, when multiplied across millions, formed collective memories that influenced the post-war identity of nations. Physical reminders endure. The fountain, erected by German prisoners at Camp Hearn in Texas, symbolizes human decency amid conflict, while the largely unmarked mass graves in Siberia attest to calculated cruelty and systemic neglect. Between these monuments of humanity and of exploitation lies a broader reflection on national character. The fate of each German soldier, whether preserved or lost, often hinged on the uniform of the captor rather than personal merit. Their experiences underscore a critical truth. While individuals are subject to historical forces beyond their control, states make deliberate choices that determine these outcomes. Decisions to provide nourishment or to withhold it, to offer medical care or to exploit labor, to maintain communication or impose isolation, all reflect the ethical framework and values of the governing power, leaving long-lasting consequences. The treatment of defeated foes reveals the deeper moral identity of a nation and shapes the trajectory of the world in the aftermath of conflict. German POWs under Soviet custody were not released until January 1956, yet the lessons of their suffering resonate well beyond that date. Even amid the extremities of war, the potential for humane conduct persists, and the presence or absence of such behavior becomes a defining element of civilization. The historical verdict is clear. The manner in which societies treat captives conveys far more about a nation's lasting legacy than the immediate outcomes of battles. The story of these prisoners begins and ends with the randomness of capture, dictated by geography, circumstance, and sheer luck. Yet embedded within this apparent helplessness is a profound message. The ethical choices made by victors toward the vanquished distinguish mere military success from enduring civilizational achievement. Respecting the humanity of those defeated transforms fleeting victories into lasting testimony of a society's principles, offering an enduring benchmark for how future conflicts might be approached.